All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're headed to 1947 Los Angeles.
Ooh, classic.
It really is. We're diving into the Black Dahlia case, the unsolved murder of Elizabeth Short. And you sent in some seriously fascinating articles about it.
Yeah, this case, it just never gets old, does it?
Definitely not. It's got that gruesome murder,
Yeah.
but it's the mountain of unanswered questions that really grabs you.
Totally. And the media went wild. It's like they poured gasoline on the whole thing right from the start.
Oh, for sure. And for me, I'm all about separating fact from fiction, especially in a case this tangled. So before we even get to the really disturbing stuff, let's talk about Elizabeth Short. She was only 22 when she was murdered, and honestly, her life story feels almost as mysterious as the murder itself.
Yeah. I mean, we've got the basics. Born in Boston, moved around a lot, ended up in California living with her dad. But think about it. This was the Great Depression. Families everywhere were struggling, and Elizabeth's family, they were definitely not an exception. All that moving around paints a pretty clear picture of hardship. And you have to wonder, how much did that shape her path?
It's a really good point. And then there's this whole aspiring actress thing. So many stories focus on that Hollywood dream, but was that really her, or is it just part of the Black Dahlia myth? Like, did the media just run with that?
It's a huge debate. And honestly, we may never really know. Some people say, yeah, she wanted stardom. But you look at the facts, no acting credits, nothing solid to show she worked in the industry at all. Makes you think maybe the media just blew that aspiring actress thing way out of proportion. You know how they can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Seems like they had a massive impact on how people saw Elizabeth Short, both before and after her death.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. It's January 15th, 1947, and her body is discovered. Just a vacant lot in Limer Park, which back then was pretty much undeveloped.
And the way she was found? Chillen doesn't even cover it. It instantly told you this was no ordinary murder. It was a statement. Brutal, premeditated, the whole scene carefully arranged.
From the articles, I remember. She was naked, cut in half at the waist, imposed. Just awful.
Yeah, and the mutilation, way beyond what you'd expect in a crime of passion. The autopsy is horrifying, the injuries. And the killer used a hemicorporectomy. Cutting the body in half. That takes a specific type of knowledge, anatomical knowledge. It's unsettling, to put it mildly.
This wasn't someone snapping. It was calculated, every detail planned out.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what kind of person could even do this, and why? What could the motive possibly be?
You hit the nail on the head, the cuts, the staging, that level of control, that detachment. It's fascinating, but also scary. This wasn't just about ending a life. It was a message, a spectacle.
Wow. Okay, so then we've got the LAPD on the case. I can only imagine the pressure they were under to solve this thing, especially with the media blowing up about it every day.
Oh, absolutely. It was massive, one of their biggest investigations ever. Resources poured in. They chased hundreds of leads, interviewed, countless people, analyzed every scrap of evidence they could find.
And yet, nothing. Still unsolved. How is that even possible? Was the killer just that good, or did the media actually make it harder to solve?
I think it's both. Think about it. A crime that brutal, that planned out, that screams intelligent, methodical, maybe even someone who knew how to stay hidden.
Like they'd prepped for this, knew how to not leave a trace?
Exactly. And then, you throw in that media frenzy, which was insane, even for back then. Reporters were tripping over each other for info, putting out stuff that wasn't even confirmed, stories that were blown way out of proportion. That can mess up an investigation real quick.
Look, they created so much noise that the actual facts got buried.
Exactly. And the pressure to solve it, to have answers that can lead to mistakes, missed details, even the nickname Black Dahlia, it's catchy, but it added to the frenzy, made it harder to focus on the facts of the case.
Makes sense. So where'd the nickname even come from? Was Elizabeth Short known as the Black Dahlia before all this, or did the media make that up?
It's unclear. There are a few ideas floating around. Maybe people called her that because of her dark hair, the way she dressed, maybe even a riff on the Blue Dahlia, that film noir movie that was out around the same time.
Yeah, that connection to Hollywood, to that whole film noir vibe. It fits the story the media wanted to tell, doesn't it?
For sure. But it's also possible reporters made it up after she died. Playing up the dark, gruesome side of things. Either way, the name stuck, and suddenly Elizabeth Short isn't a person anymore. She's this symbol of tragedy.
It's a good reminder that even though this case is fascinating, at its core, it's about a young woman who was brutally murdered.
Yeah, easy to get lost in the theories, in the intrigue. But we gotta remember, Elizabeth Short was real. She had a life, a story. And it was cut way too short.
Absolutely. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's talk suspects. Over 150 people were considered suspects, but no one was ever charged. That right there tells you how complicated this is. How could the LAPD not pin it down?
The list of suspects is wild. You've got Mark Hansen. He was loaded, owned a nightclub, apparently let Elizabeth stay at his place for a bit. Some people think she might have turned him down, and that's his motive.
But wouldn't rejecting someone be a pretty weak reason for a murder this horrific? What else could it be?
You're right to question that. It's dangerous to assume motives, especially with so little information. Maybe there was more to their connection, or maybe Hansen was involved in something else entirely, something that put Elizabeth in danger. And then you have George Hodel, a doctor, and guess what? His own son, who used to be LAPD, actually accused him of the murder after he died.
Whoa, that's intense. Being accused by your own kid.
Hmm.
And a doctor. That almost seems too perfect for the Black Dahlia, right?
Yeah.
Like, it fits with the precision of the cuts, the whole anatomical knowledge thing.
Right. It's like a plot twist in a movie. But just because someone could have done it doesn't mean they did. The evidence against Hodel, it's mostly circumstantial.
So another possible connection, but no proof. Okay, and there's one more name that keeps popping up. Leslie Dillon. He was a mortician's assistant, right?
Yep. And that's where things get really interesting. Dillon's link to Elizabeth Short might be through some kind of hotel robbery scheme. One theory says she knew something she shouldn't have, maybe saw something go down. And Dillon, well, with his background, he knew how to handle a body, how to make it disappear. It's dark, but it fits.
So not a personal grudge, more like silencing a witness.
Exactly. And to make things even crazier, this theory points to a dirty cop, Detective Phineas Brown. He was one of the lead investigators, but this theory says he was covering for Dillon, maybe even helped stage the scene to throw everyone off.
Wait, a full-on conspiracy. Now we're talking. That changes everything. Makes you wonder how much of the official story we can even trust. I mean, will we ever know what really went down?
It just goes to show, even with a case this famous, some stuff stays hidden. And honestly, that's part of what makes it so fascinating. Missing pieces, hidden motives, people who might not be who they seem. It's a puzzle.
A puzzle where we might never have all the pieces. But hey, that's what makes these deep dives so fun. We're not just looking for answers. We're exploring different ideas, facing those unanswered questions, and finding the human stories behind it all. And I have a feeling we're just getting started. So we're dealing with a ton of suspects, a media circus, and those creepy letters. And reading through these articles, it's crazy how many different theories are out there. It seems like everyone who looks at this case comes up with their own idea about who did it and why.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what happens with a case this big, this unsolved. It's like a blank slate. Everyone wants to fill in the gaps, make sense of something so senseless.
Like, we can't help but try to connect the dots, even if we have to stretch the truth a little. One theory that really got me was the one from Steve Hodel, George Hodel's son, the doctor we talked about earlier.
Oh, right, the Black Dahlia Avenger theory. It's definitely a compelling story. Steve Hodel has been digging into his father's past for years. Old police files, photographs, even his own memories, trying to build a case against him.
It's kind of wild, right? The dedication is impressive, but also a little creepy. Like, he's got to prove his dad did it, even if it means unearthing some seriously dark family secrets. And then there's the whole thing about him finding photos of Elizabeth Short in his dad's stuff. That just adds to the creep factor.
Yeah, that's a big part of his evidence, and it's definitely interesting. But here's the thing. Those photos have never been officially confirmed. We don't know for sure when they were taken, how they ended up with George Hodel. It's all speculation.
Another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit. But even without the photos, you still have the fact that George Hodel was a doctor. That seems to line up with the theory, especially with how precise the cuts were on Elizabeth Short's body.
Yeah, that's what Steve Hodel argues, that his dad's medical knowledge, his understanding of anatomy, explains how the killer knew what they were doing. He also points out that George Hodel was a suspect in another unsolved murder, his secretary, Ruth Spaulding. So there are definitely some unsettling similarities there.
It's like we're swirling around all these puzzle pieces, but we can't find that one that makes everything click. Do you think there's any chance Steve Hodel could be right? Could his theory actually be proven?
It's possible, but it would take some really strong evidence that hasn't surfaced yet. The LAPD hasn't officially reopened the case based on what Steve Hodel found, and a lot of his claims have been challenged by other researchers.
So another potential lead that goes nowhere, or at least a very tangled path. Okay, let's switch gears. There's this other theory I found really interesting. One of the articles mentioned a book called Black Dahlia, Red Rose. It takes a totally different approach to the case.
Oh, yeah, that one focuses on Leslie Dillon, the mortician's assistant. It's a good read, even if it gets a little speculative at times. The author, Pugh Eatwell, suggests that Elizabeth Short might have been killed because she stumbled onto a hotel robbery scheme involving Dylan and some of his buddies.
Wait, so now we're talking organized crime. That adds a whole new level of complexity.
Yeah.
But how does a hotel robbery turn into such a brutal murder? What's the connection?
That's where it gets a bit fuzzy. The theory depends on the idea that Elizabeth Short knew about this robbery. Maybe she saw something she wasn't supposed to, or even got involved somehow. And Dylan, with his background, he knew how to get rid of a body, make it disappear. Gruesome, but it makes kind of sense.
So not so much about revenge, more about silencing someone who knew too much.
Right. And it gets even crazier. This theory also says a cop, Detective Phineas Brown, was involved in the cover-up. He was one of the main investigators, but this book suggests he was protecting Dylan, maybe even helped stage the crime scene to confuse everyone else.
Whoa, now that's a real conspiracy. A dirty cop? A cover-up.
Yeah.
It really makes you question everything we think we know about this case. It's like, will we ever really get to the bottom of this?
It's a good reminder that even with all the documentation, the press coverage, some things might stay buried forever, and that's part of what makes this case so gripping.
Totally. Okay, so we've got these theories, but there's another layer we can't forget about. Those potential links to other unsolved murders. The Cleveland Torso murders, the lipstick murders in Chicago. It's like the Black Dahlia case might be part of something bigger, something darker, stretching across the whole country. Do any of the theories we've talked about explain those connections?
It's a question that's fueled a lot of debates. Some people think the Black Dahlia murder was the work of a serial killer who was active in multiple states. They point to the brutality, the fact that the victims were all women, and that so many of these cases are still unsolved.
But hold on. Wouldn't it be almost impossible for a serial killer to operate like that back then? I mean, communication and travel weren't what they are today.
You're right. It would be incredibly difficult. And while those similarities are interesting, we got to be careful about jumping to conclusions. Just because things look alike doesn't mean they're connected. There could be other reasons why these crimes share certain features.
It's a good point. We can't let our need for answers lead us down the wrong path. We need evidence, not just speculation. But I have to admit, the thought of a serial killer moving around the country back then, it's terrifying and fascinating at the same time. It makes you wonder if there are other unsolved cases out there that could be connected to this.
It's a chilling thought, and it's something investigators have definitely considered. But without solid proof, it's all just guesswork. And that brings us back to the biggest challenge with this case. There's no smoking gun. We have all these theories, all these suspects, years of investigation. But nothing concrete, nothing that points directly to the killer.
It's like the killer was too smart, too careful, or maybe just got lucky and slipped through the cracks. But even without a clear answer, I think there's a lot we can take away from this. It makes you think about the darkness that's out there, how vulnerable we all are, and just how mysterious the human heart can be.
I agree. The Black Dahlia case is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones that don't have an ending, the ones that leave us with more questions than answers. And that's okay. Sometimes the journey, the search for truth, is just as important as finding a definitive solution.
So as we go deeper into this case, it's important to remember that we're not just trying to solve a crime. We're exploring human nature, the limits of what we can know, and the power of mystery. And I think this case is going to keep us guessing for a long time to come. You know, it's just wild how a murder from, 1947 can still spark so much discussion. We've gone through the facts, the suspects, all these theories, and still I feel like we're just barely scratching the surface of the Black Dahlia.
It's the nature of cold cases, right?
Yeah.
Especially ones that really grab hold of the public's imagination. They become more than just crimes. They're like cultural landmarks almost. Mirrors reflecting our anxieties, our morbid curiosities, and that deep desire for justice we all have.
Yeah, I get that. And in this case, the media, they were a huge part of building that narrative, often blurring the lines between what's real and what's not. We talked about how that frenzy might have actually hurt the investigation. Makes you wonder, if the media hadn't gone so crazy, would Elizabeth Short's story be different? Would we even remember it?
It's an interesting thought. The media's obsession with the Black Dahlia, it took this case and turned it into something huge, a national story. But by doing that, they kind of, they took away some of Elizabeth Short's humanity, turned her into a symbol, something to gawk at. Maybe if they'd been more careful, more sensitive, the focus would have stayed on finding her killer, not on sensationalizing her life and death.
It's a tough line to walk, isn't it? Wanting to understand these horrible things, but also respecting the victims, their families. Something we all have to think about, not just with this case, but with any true crime story we come across.
Absolutely. True crime is everywhere now, and it's easy to forget that real people are at the heart of these stories. We can't exploit tragedy, can't profit off it, can't turn violence into entertainment. We need that empathy, that understanding that these are real lives we're talking about.
That's a really important point. And to you, listening, you send us these articles, so clearly you want to go deeper, right? You're not just looking for a simple answer. You want to understand the bigger picture, what this case says about us, about society. So, expert speaker, what are some of the bigger questions we should be asking here?
I think one of the most fascinating things about the Black Dahlia is how it shows our need for answers, our obsession with mysteries. You have this young woman full of hopes and dreams, brutally murdered, and after all these years, we still don't know who did it. That lack of resolution, it leaves a space for all these theories, for speculation, for a kind of, I don't know, a dark fascination that pulls you in.
Like the fact that it's unsolved makes it more appealing somehow. If we knew who did it, why they did it, would we still be this drawn to the Black Dahlia?
Exactly. It makes you think maybe it's the mystery itself, more than the murder, that keeps us coming back. The unknown, the unanswered questions. Those are the things that drive us to try and solve the puzzle, even if it's impossible to do.
It's like a puzzle box you can't resist opening, even though you know there might be something disturbing inside. And in a case like this, something disturbing, maybe it's a reflection of ourselves, of the dark side of human nature.
You got it. The Black Dahlia case forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths. Violence against women, how power and privilege can protect people who do terrible things. It reminds us that even in a place like Hollywood, where everyone's chasing their dreams, there's a dark side. And sometimes that darkness wins.
It's a pretty heavy thought, something that sticks with you after you really dive into this case. But we can't just ignore that darkness, right? We have to face it, try to understand it if we want to stop it from happening again.
Couldn't agree more. And while we may never know for sure who killed Elizabeth Short, just exploring this case, thinking about all the angles, the unanswered questions, that's valuable in itself. It makes us think critically, question what we think we know, and be aware of the forces, both inside us and in the world around us, that can lead to these tragedies.
So as we wrap up this Black Dahlia deep dive, I want to leave you with this. What if her story hadn't ended so tragically? Would she have just faded away, another face lost in the Hollywood crowd? Or would she have become a star, like she dreamed?
We'll never know, of course, but for me, that question makes you realize how fragile life is, how unpredictable it can be. Elizabeth Short's story, star or not, was cut short. And that loss, that potential she never got to fulfill, maybe that's the saddest part of this whole thing.
And maybe that's why the Black Dahlia still has this hold on us. It's a reminder that even when you're chasing fame and fortune, life can be so short. And sometimes searching for answers just leads to more questions.
The Black Dahlia case shows us that some mysteries might never be solved, but trying to understand them, facing the unknown, can be its own reward.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And a huge thank you to our listener for sending in those articles. They really got us thinking. We hope this has given you some new perspectives on this fascinating case and inspired you to keep exploring the mystery of the Black Dahlia.